I wrote my thesis in college on labor economics, and worked in the White House after college, focusing on the employment rate because this is right after the last recession. Worked in McKinsey Consulting, doing a lot of education, vocational training work, and then joined a labor marketplace startup. And I learned about agriculture and this specific problem of the labor problem through my cousin Marsha, who's a farmer in Hollister, California, in the Central Valley. And Marsha was trying to grow her farm, and she asked for my help looking at her financials. And it was clear that she's a really well respected farmer. She sells Michelin starred restaurants. She grows great produce. She speaks at conferences. She focuses on sustainability. She has great relationships with her workforce, but she didn't have enough labor to pick the crop if she were to grow her farm. And that was like, crazy to me that you could be that good at your job and still not be able to grow because of things outside of your control. And then I learned about H-2A through one of the workers on her farm who was undocumented, who said, he's from Oaxaca. He said, in Mexico, there's a visa we treat like gold, but nobody knows how to get it. And when I started looking into it, I learned, this visa is big, it's growing, it's uncapped. All the big farms are relying on it. Small farms are relying on it, but nobody really understands how it works. It's very complex. It's highly fragmented in terms of like the providers you use to help get the visa, and there's no technology around it. And if you think about all the things you need to bring a technology solution into a market, it needs to be a big problem, a growing market, fragmented, complex, and in need of technology. If Microsoft has 90% market share in an industry, you're not going to disrupt it with technology. So this, like H-2A and this ag labor problem had all these issues in spades, and it was clear that like nobody was bringing technology into the space. And so I started shadowing farmers and kind of just going really deep and seeing that there was dire need for not only a software solution to make H-2A more streamlined, but really to run the back office as a whole. So from payroll to timekeeping to food safety compliance to labor compliance, everything's being done manually, and farms are just like one of the more laggard industries in terms of adopting technology in the back office. So there's been a ton of investment in technology in the field and on the production side of agriculture. But when it comes to managing and hiring and finding your labor force, there's been no technology adoption until now.
Yeah. So as you're kind of doing these ride-alongs, if you don't mind me calling that, like what are you seeing is like the problem on the employer side as well as the employee side? Like how laborious is this process? I mean, are they going through the steps, or are they just saying like, we can't even go through the steps, this is too difficult? Like what were you finding?
I mean, it's going to vary if you're talking about a small farm that's brand new to the program versus a big farm that's been doing this for 10 years. But both are struggling with it because you have a manual process of all this paperwork you need to fill out worker by worker. When you're hiring somebody, when you're applying for the visa, there's a lot of regulation that you're unfamiliar with. So you're getting denials that you have to respond to. And it's just kind of a lack of knowledge on all of the different aspects of the program that you need to comply with, first to get approval to bring in workers, then to bring in the workers in a compliant way, then to manage them in a compliant way, and manage that process in a compliant way. So we work with farms that are bringing in one worker and farms that are bringing in 6,000 workers, and so the problems vary. But it boils down to farmers want to farm. They don't like paperwork. They don't like the back office, and they don't have any tools or workflows built for their industry. So they're trying to take a bunch of disconnected systems, like, you might have software for timekeeping or software for payroll or for accounting that aren't talking to each other, and trying to map them all together. And where the software doesn't support what you're doing it manually. So for example, we have a digital onboarding product that's compliant with all the regulations for agriculture. And that means that instead of taking 20 to 30 minutes for every worker you're onboarding, it takes 2 minutes. So those are like little things that we were doing to just either save them time or help them maintain compliance when you're not always familiar with what the rules are across every aspect of the program.
At the beginning of the conversation, you said I came at this from the labor side of things and then kind of discovered the ag problem. I feel like anybody who employs people knows that even the simplest stuff is way more difficult than it probably needs to be. I mean, the last document that I signed today before you and I talked was we hired a new employee in the state of Tennessee. We're not located in the state of Tennessee, so we have to file all this, and every state's got a different process for it. So, I mean,
Yeah.
here we are, an established company with, good operations people, and it's still laborious for us. So when you're employing at a much bigger scale, I would assume, as you talk about this solution to growers and different operations, I'm guessing they're not saying, no, we've got it under control. They're probably like, yeah, what do you know? What can you help us smooth out, right?
Yeah, I mean, like hiring, payroll, and labor compliance is something that every farm struggles with, and it doesn't matter if you've been doing this, for 6 generations. It's just not a clean process, and like I know for our company, we have employees in 30 states, and we rely on our HRIS system to guide us to make sure we're doing everything correctly. I wouldn't know on my own, where to file insurance and what's different in Washington versus Idaho. So that's definitely a huge value add that we bring to our customers is in the weeds kind of knowledge and software to support just managing those workflows. And it's not just state by state, it's even county by county. There's differences in agriculture. And so that's not something anybody wants to worry about. You want to run your business and grow your business. You don't want to worry about, are we doing, unemployment taxes correctly?
Yeah. Whenever I'm just curious, whenever you're, you know, over dinner or out to drinks with friends and they ask, hey, what are you up to? How do you explain what CISO labor is to them?
Um, Yeah, I mean, it depends on if I'm giving the elevator pitch or the longer
Right.
story, but essentially, we help farms with their biggest pain point, which is bringing in legal labor and managing that labor in a compliant way. Um, so that's kind of like the shortest possible way to explain it. So, some people call it like a rippling or a gusto for agriculture. It's actually really hard to find one company to compare ourselves to. We're not the Uber for this or the rippling for that because we have a team on the ground in Mexico and in Guatemala supporting that, like all the different components of hiring workers. We've got services and software for compliance. So we've got support with recruiting sometimes. So there's not a clean analogy to what we do. There's elements of service titans, vertical software for the trades industry. There's a lot of similarities there. There's similarities with what Workrise or RigUp used to does with oil and gas workers. There's similarities with rippling. But yeah, we it's a hodgepodge of, but the cleanest way to say it is vertical software for agriculture with a focus on labor and hiring workers.
Yeah. And so as you develop your product and you start to introduce this to some farmers, who were the early adopters and what was their reception to it as you explained to them kind of what your value prop is and what the software could do?
Well, the very first customer was an ostrich farmer in California, and I was cold calling the smallest farms in America, and I was saying, hey, we'll do your visa for free if you'll let us do it, so we can learn. Um, that's very different from now. We employ 12 of the 25 largest employers in the industry, so our profile has changed in terms of what our customers look like. But I'd met somebody at a wedding early on who worked in insurance for agribusiness, and he introduced me to a lot of his clients early on because he knew how big of a pain point H-2A was. So these were like mid-market avocado and citrus farmers in California that were willing to take a chance on us, and essentially I had a designer help me mock up what a website that didn't exist, showed them, hey, like, this is what you'll work with if you work with us. And then when they said, sure, we'll try it with you, then I had to build that website before we got started. So it was definitely, leveraging relationships and luck. And, my cousin was her farm was one of our first customers as well. And then once we figured it out, we just kind of started cold calling farms that were connected to these guys, and then just going bigger and bigger as we got more attention and more confidence in what we were doing, and then hired attorneys and people to really like complement all the different aspects of the service that we were offering.
That's awesome. So from those early days where you're kind of like saying, hey, for free, let us learn through this MVP process to now you're signing some of these major clients, huge employee headcount type groups. Like how would you how would you describe what those stages of that journey to this point have there been like major milestones that you've kind of hit along the way, and in terms of where you could go, like where do you think you're at on this journey right now? Still early days, you think, or how would you frame it?
Yeah, it's definitely still early days. I mean, the beginning was like learning, and then it was figuring out, well, what is the roadmap? Like we want to help farms do this process of getting their workers, getting this visa done correctly, and just kind of being a player. And then we wanted to become, hey, like, well, what can we do to differentiate ourselves? And one of the things we learned is that in the industry, on average, workers arrive 2 days late. So if you say, we need workers January 1st, they're arriving January 3rd. And so we figured out, all these different ways to improve and streamline the process, so that on average, our workers, or if you work with us, the workers arrive half a day early. And so we wanted to differentiate ourselves by saying this isn't a cheaper service. This is a premium service that, we're really going above and beyond in terms of customer service and how we serve our customers and communicate with them. And then it was, hey, we're not just a premium service. We are a service that has a software platform that nobody else has, that proactively helps you manage your workforce and think about and address problems before they arise. And then, it evolved into, well, once we spent more time with customers, we realized what are all the complementary services and workflows that are related to, bringing in labor, on the management side. And so we started building out those features. And then ultimately, we want to be an end-to-end HRIS for agriculture, and to be the single system of record for how you run and manage your workforce. And then eventually accounting and go from HRIS to the ERP that you run the farm off of. So there's
Yep.
still very much a lot of steps ahead of us. Um, and like the model of that, any vertical SaaS company is typically doing a land and expand model. So
Yep.
you're landing a customer with a core product that serves, one of their biggest needs. But the more time you're spending with these customers, the more you're understanding everything else that they're using 3, 4 different vendors, software systems, service providers for. And you want to, take all of that and be the sole platform that they can run everything off of. And so that's very much our goal. So there's a long road ahead.
Yeah, it sounds like you found the beachhead with H-2A that is the pain point that you felt like you could get in and solve first, right?
Yeah. And I'd like to say we're lucky, because there's a luck to starting any business. So we're definitely lucky that, one of the things that really convinced investors that, hey, we're onto something is, I was pitching investors, and then COVID happened, right? And like when the company was really in its early days, and Trump banned every single visa group from entering the US at the start of COVID, understandably, because nobody knew, how the
Yeah.
disease was spread, if you're bringing workers over, like what's going to happen. Within 24 hours, he unbanned only H-2A. So all these other visas, H-1Bs, O-1s, they weren't allowed to come into the US, but H-2A was, because that's how essential it is to our economy, to our food supply chain, to our, food security. And then all of a sudden, I'm getting all these investors calling and saying, "Okay, no, we get it now." So that was definitely like a helpful moment.
Silver lining in that space. Yeah.
Yeah.
What are, I mean, it feels like you're fulfilling a real sharp pain point for some, but I'm guessing still in conversations within the industry, there's misconceptions that you have to kind of overcome or maybe explain your point of view on. Do you come into that type of? I'm assuming with labor, you definitely do.
You mean
What kind of
you
misconceptions
mean
do you feel like you need to free up within the industry or maybe outside the industry where you're like, actually, here's my point of view on it. That's a little bit different than yours.
yeah. Yeah, so I'll start with outside the industry. So outside the industry, there's two things that people often say. Well, isn't automation just going to replace all this labor? And the answer is like, yes, maybe in 50 years, but it's definitely not in 3 to 5 years. And if you talk to the CEOs of a lot of the big, vertical farming companies or automation companies, none of them are saying, yeah, we're going to have 1%, 5%, 10% market share in the next 5, 10 years. They're saying this is a 10 to 20 year horizon before you see a dent in how specialty crop fruits and vegetables are picked and grown, and so automation is going to help improve things, but it is not going to replace labor in the fields in the immediate future. So that's just one like very big misconception. Farmers know that. Investors, people outside the industry don't really know that. And then the second is, well, isn't this a really political issue? What if the industry gets regulated further? Are you guys at risk of not being able to do what you do if there's a regulatory hit? And it's a fair question, but H-2A is actually, first, what I mentioned earlier, how Trump had to unban H-2A immediately after the pandemic started because of how essential this workforce is. H-2A is a program that isn't perfect, but is really effective in supporting farms with their labor needs, and has pretty widely accepted bipartisan support. So you see Democrats and Republicans both supporting the H-2A program. There's a bill called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which passed through the House twice and has always been stalled in the Senate. And that's a bill with bipartisan support. And that bill says, hey, let's give a path to citizenship for undocumented workers here in the US, but let's also expand the H-2A program. So the two are not mutually exclusive. And ultimately, if there's immigration reform, it's going to be covering those two issues. And no one is saying, hey, let's get rid of the H-2A program or replace it, because it's actually very essential to our economy. So there's a misconception that this is a fragile program. This program's been around since the 80s, and it's only growing. And any path towards improving our immigration system as it relates to agriculture is not going to be replacing this program. It's going to be expanding it. And so that's one thing that a lot of people, don't get right or don't understand fully the dynamics.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would assume that there was some strong opinions that you're hearing from time to time.
Yeah.
What about the feedback from people who have used the product for some time? What's the feedback that they're talking about the most? Is it the time savings? Is it the you talked about the premium element to it? Like, what are you hearing feedback on of what they appreciate the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we get a lot of respect for is we're not taking software that was built for another industry and trying to force it into this industry. Everything that we built is a workflow for agriculture that really understands the dynamic of hiring and managing an agricultural workforce. So we get a lot of credit for that. But yeah, time savings, I would say, is one of the biggest factors. It's both time savings for your back office that is handling all the paperwork, but it's also time savings for your workforce. So let's say you're bringing in a couple hundred workers from Mexico, and they're coming on a bus for 6-8 hours. They get on site, and in the old model, they're standing around for another 8 hours, filling out paperwork, sometimes outside, sometimes inside, waiting for all this paperwork to get filled. And they're a bit antsy, it's uncomfortable, and so we're saving them time, because that process, instead of taking 8 hours, can take an hour to 2 hours max. So we save time for both, your workforce and your back office. And then we reduce an insane amount of paperwork. So when you're dealing with an audit, for example, you have thousands and thousands of papers that you might be physically mailing to the Department of Labor to say, hey, here are all our records. And so there's a ton of just manual work and time put into that. But there's also an element of like data privacy. So these are records that are people's social security cards and passports that are being photocopied and stored in file cabinets, not really, safely stored, and then being mailed to the government. And we've digitized that whole process end to end. So you're basically, have a single source of truth for your record keeping. It's, secure. The way we store data is the same way banks, it's the same system that is ensuring HIPAA compliance for hospitals, or data privacy for banks. So we've kind of invested really heavily in that. So there's a security element, a time savings element, and then like a paper and convenience element to it as well.
Yeah. Any way that a business interfaces with the government is usually just way more inefficient and time consuming than we want it to be. So like technology is just begging to be introduced into these systems.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I'm curious with the people, whenever you're attracting talent, because you're obviously growing and you're trying to bring in strong talent to your own team. Do you think they're attracted uh, to the company because they're passionate about labor, because they're passionate about agriculture? Is it the technology that turns them on? Is it something else?
It's a few things. I mean, I think one thing that you hear very often, whether it's from customer success, sales, or engineers, is they want to work on things that actually impact people's lives. And you know, we're able to say that very comfortably that we dramatically impact people's lives. So, you know, we signed contracts to bring in 37,000 workers last year, and we'll sign contracts for 80 to 100,000 this year. Every one of these workers is coming from you know, a country where they're making 10 to 20 times less money for the same amount of work. So they're making life-changing money, and most of that money is actually going back home as remittances. There's entire towns in Guatemala that we help bring in labor from, where 90% of the income of that town is remittances from workers that we've brought over. So that's very impactful for anybody who's looking for a company where they can have an impact and they can actually, you know, affect people's lives, and have a lot of people using the software that you're building or the software that you're selling. So that's been a huge part of it, is like the social aspect. I'm always very cautious of, you know, not leading with that. You know, I don't like to pretend like we're a nonprofit. I mean, there's a social impact aspect to what we're doing, but we're also, you know, trying to build a business that can sustain itself. So I like to talk about the business itself, and then talk about the dynamics of the industry, and the workforce that we're bringing over, and also the importance of this labor for the American food production system. Because, you know, without this, most farms that we work with wouldn't be able to operate, wouldn't be able to pick the crop. There's a saying in agriculture: the crop doesn't wait. When a fruit's ready to drop, it drops, whether your labor is here to pick it or not. So, you know, there's a really important element to both, you know, the workers we're bringing over, but also to the American food production system and to the supply chain. And when we're interviewing someone, when they're learning about our business, that comes out pretty organically, pretty quickly, and so we have a pretty good close rate with candidates we want to hire.
That's awesome. Yeah. My take on it from the outside looking in is that there was a ton of friction in this process. It was already happening, but it was just slow and time consuming and confusing and hard to navigate. And you have found a way to just focus squarely on this issue and remove a ton of that friction just to allow something that was already happening to happen a much smoother way. So if anybody wants to argue about the benefits or whatever, it's not as if you started this from scratch. Like this thing was happening. It was just really slow and laborious to begin with, right?
Yeah, yeah. I also like to clarify that. Like, we didn't invent H-2A, right? Like, so there's a program that exists. It's being used. It's growing like crazy, and we want to make it easier. We want to make it easier for the farm. We want to make it easier and streamlined for the workers. We even want to make it easier for the government stakeholders who are on the other end. And so we see all three of those as stakeholders. But, you know, it exists whether we're here or not. We just, you know, we're the only ones that have brought software, or the first ones that have brought software into the space.
Yeah. So you mentioned in the early days when you were starting to shadow some of these farmers and understand that. How long has it been since that early day to now? How much time has passed from then until now?
I mean, the first farms that I visited I would say end of 2018, early 2019. So it's been, you know, 4 or 5 years, from
Yeah,
just like exploring agriculture and exploring the market. To I started the company in uh, August in 2019.
it's a
So
lot of growth in
coming up
five
on
years.
four years.
What's been the
Yeah.
yeah, what's been the most
Well, I mean,
rewarding part
really,
for you
we
personally?
yeah, we didn't really start selling the product until, like, you know, first it was like I said, like working for free for a farmer,
Yeah.
exploring, learning. We started selling it in the last 2.5 years. So
Mm.
so that's been, yeah, quite a journey those last 2 years. I'd say like one of the biggest moments was going from, you know, small working with a small avocado farm, a small tomato farm, an ostrich farmer, to when we signed our first top 10 customer in the industry. And then, you know, he calls me the day before we start working together, and he says, you know, can I curse on here?
Yeah. Please.
Yeah, he says Michael, you know, just so you know, if you fuck this up, like, there's no lettuce at Costco, and you like ruin a contract I've had for 10 years. So like the stakes are high. Like, don't mess this up. And that was like a very real moment. I was like, okay, we're actually, you know, now we're a player in this industry, and that was a pretty like I'll never forget that call.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, for anybody who buys lettuce at Costco or is interested in the industry, where would you point them to if they want to learn more about the company?
That's a great question. I mean, we've had a few features in Forbes. We've had a few features from Andreessen Horowitz, and um, our website is pretty like in the weeds for our customers. I have a blog post I wrote on our website about why we started the company, so that would be a good starting point.
That's great. Michael, I enjoyed hearing a little bit more of the story. I think it's an interesting insight that you've come across, and to me, the value prop is clear as day. So I'm not surprised that you guys have had the success you had in such a short period of time. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And would be remiss to not shout out my co-founder, Jordan Taylor, who joined me from Farmers Business Network, which is the biggest ag tech company in the country. So, without him, none of the software exists. And he's been a transformational part of this company too. So he's probably, signing that big customer and convincing Jordan to do this with me were probably the two biggest wins that we've had to date.
That's great. Shout out to Jordan. All right.
Yeah.
We'll call that an episode. Thanks for joining.